This is the Sex and Censorship Podcast. Welcome back to the Sex and Censorship Podcast. This is number 13, I believe, and this week's podcast contains a long interview I did for C-Realm Radio, which is a Vermont radio station, to discuss porn and identity politics and fascism and a bunch of other stuff. You can find C-Realm at c-realm.com. The interview took place 2 days before the US election, and I'm recording 2 days after the reality of President Trump was announced, and obviously that reality is still sinking in. But I predicted the Trump win, and my book, Porn Panic, provides a part of the explanation for it. I'm just going to quote a paragraph from the book's very last page, which I wrote a year ago. Rustling of pages. Fascism again stalks the West in both recognizable forms and new ones. In France, draconian restrictions on speech and assembly have followed the Paris shootings of November 2015. In Poland and Denmark, the far right has gained unprecedented ground in elections. Meanwhile, in America, Donald Trump clownnishly suggests that as president he might, quote, go see Bill Gates and talk to him about closing that internet up in some way. People will say, oh, freedom of speech. These are foolish people, and we have a lot of foolish people. And, the book really looks at the rise of fascism and some of the reasons and the mechanisms for the rise of fascism, and it explains how in large part the rise of the fascist right has been mirrored by a rise of fascism on the left. Now, how does all that link to pornography? You'll have to go and buy the book and find out. You can buy Porn Panic at Amazon and elsewhere, and all good bookshops, as they say, and in doing so you support the Sex and Censorship blog and this podcast and my other sexual freedom work, on which point I should also say that this coming Monday, the 14th of November, will be the annual Sexual Freedom Awards in London. I've been nominated for an award. This is the third time I've been nominated, but I haven't yet won anything, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great accolade to be nominated. It will be an even greater accolade if I win. And most exciting, the prize is a trophy, which is a hand-carved golden penis with Aztec wings. And I really want to get my hands on one of those, as would anybody. Anyway, on with the show.
Hello, Bellows Falls. I'm KMO. Here's the intro to the show.
You're listening to WOOL Black Sheep Radio on 91.5 FM, C-Realm Radio with KMO.
Alrighty, I hear some throat clearing. I think maybe we've got Jerry Barnett on the line. Jerry, are you there?
Yeah, that was me.
Excellent, excellent. Good to hear from you. Sorry the Skype technology didn't work out.
No, it doesn't usually. I hate Skype.
Well, you spoke to Silas when he answered the phone. Silas was just telling me about some alternatives to Skype. Silas, what were you saying?
As an alternative to Skype, I mainly use the programs Mumble and Discord. They are both free programs. I download a client, which you install. I mainly use them because they require less bandwidth than Skype. And there's some other a lot of it's personal preference, but they do require less bandwidth. And I just like them more. Discord is different than Mumble. The difference between them is just personal preference again, but, if you're interested in an alternative, check them out. They're fun, they're free, easy to set up, easy to use. Yeah.
Can you record those calls?
Actually, I do not know, and it's probably a big advantage that Skype has. I don't think you can.
Skype does not have...
Oh, you can't record a Skype? Oh, I thought you could.
You can, but not within Skype. You have to have either some mechanical setup to do it or some third-party software that does the job.
Oh, I'm pretty sure that's true with those as well. I haven't recorded calls, though, so I already know.
Alrighty, so, Jerry, I'm looking at the Zero Books page for your book, or I'm assuming it's your most recent book. I'm guessing
it is. It's my only book to date.
Oh, is it? Okay. Well, I didn't want to assume. But the book is called Porn Panic, Sex and Censorship in the UK, The Rise of the New British Anti-Sex Movement. And I imagine you have explained these topics to many people over time, so I won't do too much guiding of the conversation. But just to start things off, would you tell the listeners about somebody named Mary Whitehouse?
Mary Whitehouse was the UK's veteran morality campaigner. She began in the 1960s, and she died in 2001. And she was a vociferous and very effective campaigner. She was from the Christian right. She looked exactly like you'd expect a morality campaigner to look. And she was quite influential in changing laws. I think what's probably interesting maybe to an American audience is that we don't really have a religious right here, and we don't have a particularly religious sensibility as a nation. So she was kind of viewed as a laughing stock, but at the same time she was very effective in lobbying and in creating moral panics that got laws changed and introduced censorship.
Well, she was an anti-porn crusader coming, as you say, from the religious right, which was a bit of an outlier for your society, since you don't have the same sort of organized religious right that we have here in the United States. But in the book, you're not really talking about anti-porn crusaders who are coming from the right or from a religious perspective. What are you talking about mainly in the book?
The book is about the kind of the rise of a left-wing morality movement, and not just a morality movement, a movement of the left which holds very conservative and anti-liberal values. And really, I talk about Mary Whitehouse to set the scene that, we were in a very liberal era in the 1990s in the UK, and the death of Mary Whitehouse seemed to kind of mark the end of an era in which we got upset about, she wasn't just an anti-porn campaigner. She was she was a family values, decency kind of campaigner. She seemed to kind of mark the end of an era where people got worried about swearing or about nudity and this kind of thing. And what happened in the wake of her death, there was, I think 9/11 was very significant in changing the global zeitgeist, but the kind of the political discourse and the zeitgeist just became more and more conservative and authoritarian. But what surprised me as a veteran kind of person of the left was that, this movement mostly rose on the left of politics, and a movement attacking pornography and sexual freedom, but also attacking free speech in general, and things like equality, which, was once a bedrock of left-wing thought.
It occurs to me, and I realize this is maybe a bit of a jarring discontinuity, but at the beginning of each hour, we are supposed to share a couple of public service announcements. And I'd like to offer the radio guests the opportunity to read some of those local announcements. I think you've got a couple picked out. Would you hit us with those?
Sure. I'll just launch into the first one. So the first one is memoir workshops. Author Pam Bernard continues her popular memoir series beginning the week of November 7 at her home in Walpole. These late fall sessions will be 6 weeks, Mondays and Fridays from 1 to 4 p.m. The regular 8-week winter sessions will begin the week of January 9th. With enough interest, a Saturday morning workshop will be added. Crucial issues of craft are explored in these workshops, such as narrative stance and tone, and fresh work is generated each week from prompts. Participants bring experience to the page by harnessing memory and imagination and learn to shape their writing into compelling narratives as a way to explore and honor their lives. Pam Bernard is the author of 4 books and is an adjunct professor at Franklin Pierce University. She received her MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College and BA from Harvard University. Visit pambernard.com or call 603-756-4177 for more information.
Oh, that sounds good. I think I would like to participate in that, actually. I'm glad you read it because I hadn't seen it in the list. So what's next?
And the second one is an artisan fair. The 6th annual local arts fair, a part of New Hampshire Open Doors, will be presented by West Claremont Center for Music and the Arts and Claremont Parks and Recreation at the Claremont Savings Bank Community Center, which is at 152 South Street, Claremont, this year, in a celebration of arts, music, and food from locals as well as artists across New England. Vendors and artists who make their own products, including agriculture, are invited to apply for this balanced and juried event. $25 per space for early participants, $30 after October 28th, which is already passed, This is a 2-day event on November 5th and 6th. Oh, we're a bit late on that. During the statewide open doors event. Hours are Saturday 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and Sunday 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. So
still almost 2 hours left.
It may just be closing as we speak. Sorry about that.
No, it's 1:15 here. So
okay, you've got 45 minutes.
Dash over.
Vendor spaces are available as well as display space by commission for artists. There are limited spaces and limited availability for each product type. For more information and to fill out an application, see wcc-ma.org or contact Melissa at wcc-ma.org.
All right, so 2 New Hampshire announcements there. We are in Vermont, which is the state next door. But if I were to warm up my arm for a few minutes first, and I had one of those ring frisbees, the flying rings, I could probably step outside the radio station and throw that frisbee over into Vermont, or over into New Hampshire. We're in Vermont. There's just a river separating us.
It's, this time of year, I think I'd rather be in New England than Old England. It's kind of grey and wet here, so...
Well, it's shiny. Sun is out today. We've got some blue skies, but it's not warm, and it's not likely to be warm anytime soon. So, Jerry, let's get back into the topic of your book, but let's take a different tack in. I'm very fortunate. I'm 48 years old, and I'm very fortunate to have a 16-year-old sitting next to me. I have a 15-year-old son, but surprise, surprise, he doesn't want to talk to me very much or share much of his life with me. And Silas, I didn't go searching for Silas. He just sort of plopped into my lap here. Silas, what are you doing here at the radio station?
I'm here just to kind of learn about radio. It started with like an idea of kind of about like audio engineering in general, but then it's like radio's always been interesting, so I just kind of emailed around. KMO responded. I showed up, and I'm enjoying it. It's fun.
So this is a boon for me because, being 48, but doing a show where I talk about what's happening in the world, a lot of people in the world are a lot younger than I am. And I think I've got an idea of what it's like to be 16, but I turned 16 in 1984, and the world has changed a little bit since then. So it's really good.
Just a little.
Yeah, good to have a 16-year-old perspective. So, Silas, let me ask you, do you think that if somebody identifies as a feminist, that means they're automatically against pornography?
No. And this harkens back a little bit to last week about the blanket statements. There's a lot of different people within the feminist movement. I know some, there's some people who identify as feminists who I don't think are very nice people, and there's other people who say they're feminists who I think are great people. So I would not say everyone. I would say no. That's
okay. I hope that gives you a little inspiration and maybe optimism, Jerry.
It does, and in general, I do a lot of debates and talks at universities, and I have 3 children, none of them are in their teens. One is an adult, and the other 2 are very small, so I don't have a kid in their teens at the moment. But in general, the younger generation does give me optimism, and and of course, one of the when you're dealing with constant moral panic, which is kind of what I do, you always hear that the younger generation are dangerous, and that the influences are dangerous, and that they're going to be the downfall of society. And my feeling is that the younger generation is smarter, better informed, far more at ease with sexual issues than our generation was. I'm 3 years older than you. So yeah, I'm not one who's into millennial bashing on the whole, even though when it comes to some of the free speech issues, there are some worrying trends going on in universities and so on. But yeah, generally, I resist people who say that the youth of today are kind of don't have good values and that kind of thing. I think the youth of today are a hell of a lot better than the youth of today were when I was the youth of today.
You were the guest on an episode of the, I think it's Zero Squared podcast, which is the Zero Books podcast hosted by Doug Lane. And yeah. I'd listened to that conversation last night, and I think just in passing, you referenced the fact that here in the United States, we tend to use the words liberal and left-wing interchangeably.
Yeah.
What distinction are we missing out on by doing that?
These words are so fluid that they kind of change from place to place and from time to time. So here in the UK, liberal generally means in the centre ground. So on the left we have socialists and social democrats. On the right we have conservatives and liberals. have always been the people in the center ground. In the US, liberal means the people on the left, and it's kind of interchangeable with socialist and that kind of thing. I mean, actually, the classic version of liberal goes back to the Enlightenment, which is an incredibly important part of history, especially US history. And it really, liberalism lays down a number of principles, a number of guiding principles, and one of which is liberty, and in particular free speech. Also, the equality is an incredibly important part of liberalism, and reason, the idea that reason should triumph over mob feeling or over gut feel or common sense or whatever we want to call it. Those are all liberal values. What's interesting today is that, I think when I was growing up and I was a political activist in the 80s, liberal values were broadly associated with the left. And certainly if you go back to the 60s era, the civil rights era, the hippie era, and so on, liberalism and the left were kind of intertwined. Today, if anything, I find more of a love for liberal values among the kind of the center right and the kind of the sensible parts of the libertarian right, and a loss of liberal values on the left. So, things like, to me, equality is a non-negotiable part of liberal values, and so is free speech. But actually, certainly over on this side of the pond, most attacks on free speech are coming from the left rather than from the political right today, which is a shock to me, because I thought, my tribe is the left.
So I've heard references in various places to the illiberalism of the left, particularly on college campuses and particularly as enacted by millennial activists. But illiberal liberalism seems sort of a contradiction in terms.
It does, but, terms change over time. And I reference Orwell a few times in the book because I think Orwell was just so far-sighted. And I guess the further we go, the more far-sighted he seems. But Orwell was living in a time where he was a left-wing activist, and he believed in liberal values largely and in liberty, and yet he was seeing the rise of the Soviet Union, and the rise of Stalin in the Soviet Union, and the attack on liberal values in those days from the left. So I guess to an extent we're revisiting history. But language is very pliable, and it does morph from generation to generation. And today, people who see themselves as liberals because they may vote Democrat in the U.S. Or they may vote Labour in the U.K. are actually adopting increasingly illiberal values, and they're using the old attitudes of the left to justify those values. So, for example, I was very much part of the anti-racism movement, which is a very big thing on the political left. And today, anti-racism is used as an excuse to attack free speech. So, and to attack equality. So, you have kind of values which are established on the left. I very much am anti-racist. I'm in a mixed relationship myself. I have mixed children, and yet we've kind of got this reversal of the situation where people are branded racists, and once they're branded racist, they have their right to free speech removed from them in a very McCarthyite kind of way. So to an extent, being branded a racist today is becoming what being branded a communist was in 1950s America. It's a tool of witch hunting, and that's very upsetting and disconcerting for me, because I oppose racism, but I hate this use of the language of the anti-racist movement to attack people's free speech.
Part of the argument of your book is that there is an ongoing, or maybe cyclical is a better way to say it, movement, not in any one human culture, but just among humans generally, where we go through phases where certain elements of the population become very intolerant of any expression of female sexuality, and that in living memory that has generally come from the religious right, but now it seems to be coming from the new generation of feminists, not the women's libbers of the 1970s, but of the current crop, who are often at odds with previous generations of feminists. Would you talk about that?
Yeah. again, it shows the kind of fluidity of politics. So it's hard to tell whether the left became more conservative or whether conservatives kind of moved to the left because the left had won the previous arguments, and so it was kind of cooler to present yourself as a feminist than as someone of the religious right. But yeah, it's interesting how the language of women's rights again has been co-opted. So in the 1960s, early 70s, feminism was very much about choice and about female empowerment and female autonomy, and that if somebody wanted, it was about women becoming lawyers and presidents and fighter pilots, but it was also about women, if they wanted to, being able to show to having autonomy over their own bodies, and if they wanted to, being able to show their bodies and to be naked and to be in pornography and so on. This was without being branded a slut or whatever kind of pejorative terms. Today it shifts subtly. So we have the idea that if a woman, we have work terms like objectification, which kind of gets used to imply that if a woman chooses to go naked or to be in a porn movie, her choice affects other women. And so the idea is that by being in a porn movie, she makes a product which turns men against women, which makes men devalue women, which feeds into something called rape culture, which is a very amorphous kind of strange idea. And so her choices are under attack because her choices affect the lives and the well-being of other women. And so I deal with ideas like objectification. I mean, there's not actually a lot of evidence that male brains and that the male psyche actually behaves like this. Actually, it turns out that men who watch porn tend to have more pro-female and less misogynistic values than people who don't watch porn. For whatever reason, the links are probably quite complex. But yeah, so the language of women's rights is co-opted to attack the rights of women who do unpure things like appear in pornography or appear naked or become sex workers or become strippers or whatever. So yeah, we have a feminism which 50 years ago argued for that women should be able to do anything, and now a feminism that kind of argues subtly that if women are strippers or porn stars, then they're undermining the choices of women, the kind of advancement of women.
So you're in a position where you actually know a lot of people who work in the porn industry and also strippers or exotic dancers. How is that?
I'm a technologist by background, and I started a web software company in the mid-90s, and I quickly got involved in the porn industry, largely because the porn industry was the biggest show on the internet in those days. So I've had involvement with the porn industry for 20 years or so. I have a lot of friends and then that led me to sexual freedom activism about 10 years ago. So yeah, I have a lot of friends and acquaintances who do those, who are sex workers and strippers and porn stars and that kind of thing. And I ran my own porn site from about 2004 till 2012. And when I got involved in the porn industry, I was kind of, you could say, infected with the same mythology that many people are. And I was worried that women might be exploited or that terrible things might be going on. And I set out to find out for myself and to meet people in the industry and to ask women who actually did it, why they did it, and what their experience of doing it was. And I found out that they did it for fairly obvious reasons, that either they enjoyed it and the money was good, and some combination of those things. Sorry, I slightly lost my thread there.
Let me help you out a bit. What I was sort of laying the groundwork for was you have reported, and I just wanted to have you put your credentials on the table, why you're qualified to say this, that most of the slut-shaming experienced by people who work in adult entertainment comes from women on the left.
Yeah, certainly the organized slut shaming. And I have friends, most of the porn stars and sex workers and so on that I know, they have Facebook pages, and they have legions of people who follow them and report every single photo they put online and get their Facebook accounts closed and this kind of thing. So there's a lot of it seems to come from women, and when it's organized and politically organized, it does come from the left. The right, we don't have a religious right here, as I've said, and the right seems fairly relaxed about this kind of thing. You know, there isn't particularly an organized anti-porn or anti-sex movement on the right here anymore. That certainly the people I encounter in university debates and in debates on TV and radio are typically presenting themselves as feminists, as Marxists, as left-wing people, and using the language of the left to attack the choices of women.
So you just said there isn't an organized anti-porn movement in the right anymore. Was there once one?
Britain is very unlike the United States in this kind of way. I mean, Britain is culturally fairly relaxed about personal liberty and about people's choices. We've never had a particularly religious right or a particularly anti-sex movement. But I mean, as I said earlier, you know, Mary Whitehouse kind of represented that strand in society, and that strand in society has kind of died out. But yeah, I mean, even though we share a language and we share a big role in the founding of your country, we don't share those kinds of religious right-wing attitudes, and we never really have done. To an extent, you know, I guess that's why the founding fathers left Britain and sailed to America, because this wasn't a country that particularly had an interest in religious kind of zealots.
Well, that brings up another interesting contradiction in that here in the United States, we as a society are much more religious than you are. And we have a lot of people who are organized and who desire to clamp down on the free expression of other people. And at the same time, we have a constitution which, in the First Amendment to it, guarantees everybody the right to the freedom of speech. And that's something that you don't have in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, we don't have any strong commitments in law to free speech. And again, it's one of the funny contradictions. It was English philosophers who were the real driving force behind Enlightenment values like free speech, and to an extent the U.S. Constitution owes a lot to English philosophers. And yet you had an Enlightenment revolution and we didn't. So even though we have a kind of cultural tolerance of minorities and of free speech and so on, we don't have a legal defense of them. And so we have a lot of censorship laws, a lot of them very small and petty. But when you count them all up, there's a hell of a lot of censorship in this country, and we don't have an easy way to defend against them. We don't have an ACLU who can just go to court and challenge our censorship laws on First Amendment grounds, because we don't have a First Amendment.
You've talked about how you're in the UK and the situation there is somewhat different than it is here, but in certain respects there are shared sort of milestones, particularly in the history of the development of feminism. And in feminism, or in the history of feminism, you talk about a group of people you call the McDworkinites. Would you say more about that?
Yeah, I took the term McDworkinites from, there's a book called Defending Pornography by Nadine Strossen, excuse me, who she was the president of the ACLU, and she wrote about them in some detail. The anti-sex feminist movement was really founded by two women, Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, and it really originates in the late 1970s. And it kind of shows the shifting zeitgeist, across the West, not just in the United States, that the late 60s was really the peak of liberalism, in the United States and here as well. And that by the late 70s, those organs of the left and those movements and organizations created by the left had subtly become more conservative. And so I think McKinnon and Dworkin really saw that liberalism had kind of been a victorious force, and so to an extent they sought to introduce conservative values into liberalism, and so they created anti-sex feminism, and in the 1980s they worked fairly closely with the Reagan administration to try to attack pornography, which caused a great split in the feminist movement in America, because many feminists were still fighting to defend abortion rights and so on, and yet here were feminists standing with an administration that was attacking abortion rights. So I see anti-sex feminism as a kind of a key moment in the kind of decline of liberal values on the left, and to an extent, I think Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin are very influential people historically.
My girlfriend regularly steps up to defend those two names when I mention them in any sort of negative context. And when I ask her, what is it about their message that, she approves of, she just says that, she encountered them when she was in college, and it was impressed upon her that these were important people in the fight for women's rights. And that's about as specific as she can get. But their names, they do carry some weight. Even, I would think maybe even especially among people who aren't really all that clear about what McKinnon and Dworkin had to say.
Yeah, they were very influential, and they, as I say, I make the point in the book, and I have a chapter devoted to them and to what happened then, because they really undermined the idea on the left that free speech is an important thing, because they created the idea that there are some lines that shouldn't be crossed, and for them, pornography was the line. Even though when they talked about pornography, actually they were referring to all sorts of sexual expression, down to the softest of erotic imagery. So yeah, they are influential, and their books are still read. And many people will disagree with me, but I think following on from the 80s, feminism became such a broad church and a broad range of ideas, and often completely contradictory ideas, that I'm not sure how much value feminism as a movement has. There are certainly, there are many people who call themselves feminists. It like many things, it's almost become a fashion label, and that doesn't just apply to feminism. It applies to things like Marxism, where I often encountered Marxists today who have no idea what Marxism is, and stand for very different things to what Karl Marx said. But yeah, I mean, feminism began as a very tightly focused movement in the late 1960s and has diffused into a broad label that encompasses almost any view, as long as it's kind of related to women in some way.
Well, just as feminism is sort of a vague word, so is the word fascism, which I think comes up a lot in discussions of free speech and the desire to curtail free speech.
Yeah. And I use the word a lot in the book, and I've been criticized for it, because everyone uses the word to attack everyone else. It's one of those words that probably shouldn't be used, but I do use it. But I kind of go out of my way to define what fascism is. And fascism I define as a fundamental conservative, ultra-conservative attack on the values of the Enlightenment, and the three values that I think are most important are liberty, equality, and reason. And so when you have a movement which goes out of its way to attack those three values, then I think the word fascism should be applied. And unfortunately, fascism is so tightly linked in with Nazi Germany and so on, that people tend to associate it with the right and with anti-Semitism, with a specific set of ideas. But no, fascism is ultra conservatism. It's family values. It's kind of what the Republican right stands for to an extent. It's a reaction against all progress. It's a reaction against science and against liberty and against people's right to say what they want, even if it offends people. So yeah, I do use it, and I sometimes as I read reviews of my book, I wonder whether I should have used the word so much, because it is so kind of all-encompassing. But I think we are in a new age of fascism, and I think we're, to an extent, people haven't noticed because so much of these fascist attitudes come from people who call themselves liberals. And it's not just on the left. I mean, Donald Trump may or may not be a fascist, but certainly the movement he's raising is a fascist type movement. It's a reaction against change, and that's really what fascism is.
I will resist the urge to make this a conversation about Donald Trump. It's very easy to do, in the United States.
Yeah, I realize
this
is a bit controversial at this point in time.
Just a tad.
Yeah, not just controversial. It's just sort of it's bait to take us way off topic. I've heard you use the phrase counter-enlightenment in place of fascism, which I think for your purposes is probably more specific. It's more communicative of what you're about. Can you give examples of how anti-sex leftists have attempted to compromise or fight against liberty, equality, and rationality?
Liberty, the book focuses a lot on free expression. So, attacks on free expression are widespread, and I think they began with porn and with the anti-sex feminists, but broadened out from there. So I think, as we've mentioned, the rise of no platform and the rise of ideas like cultural appropriation in universities, I see as very dangerous attacks on free expression. The idea that cultures are owned by particular people and that other people should leave them alone. These are attacks on free expression from the left, and there are many examples. And again, as I've mentioned, things like being accused of being homophobic or racist, kind of ways of silencing people in quite a McCarthyite way. In terms of equality, then I look at this in the book because race is an issue which I'm deeply interested in, and we've had a kind of flip where the 1960s, the civil rights movement and the anti-racist movements which followed, and I was part of the British anti-racist movement, I always have been really, that they were very much about establishing equal rights and equal treatment for minorities, and there's been this kind of flip where suddenly where minorities and women are now deemed to have special privilege, and so on the surface this looks like a kind of liberal way to kind of give people a step up, but actually it's a fundamental attack on equality. And if you go back to the 1960s, to the feminists and the civil rights people of the 60s, they very clearly were wary of special privilege. And this goes back to Martin Luther King and to feminists of the time. They didn't want women or black people to be elevated to a different status. What they were calling for was equality, and the rise of special privilege, the idea that so-called oppressed minorities should have special rights to balance their oppression, is an attack on equality, even though a kind of cleverly veiled one. And again, cultural appropriation comes into that discussion, because the idea, when you explore cultural appropriation, which is an idea that fascinates me, the idea is that it's okay that white people say shouldn't appropriate African cultures, whatever that means, but that black people can appropriate white cultures because black people are oppressed and white people are privileged. And this kind of establishes the idea that black people and white people are not equal, and this is a fundamental attack on the values of the 1960s generation. When you get to reason and to reason thought, really, which means for science, as far as I'm concerned, I look at one area in the book, which is the idea that science is increasingly sure that men and women are fairly different creatures, and have evolved differently, and that men and women have different behaviors from each other. And equality was never about declaring men and women to be the same thing. Equality is about giving men and women equal rights and equal opportunities. That's kind of moved on to the extent that many feminists and many gender theorists and so on today are insistent that gender is a social construct and that it has no roots in biology. And this fundamentally contradicts science and increasingly contradicts science, which says that men and women are not the same. And so if you're looking for equal outcomes in men and women, that may never happen because we're not on average the same things. There are other examples of attacks on science coming from the left. So there's an increasing anti-GMO, genetically modified movement that comes from Greens and so on, which is utterly irrational. Genetically modified technology is really a huge human breakthrough and has all sorts of potential to feed the poorest people in the world and so on. And yet there's a rising backlash against GMO from a very anti-science perspective. And yeah, there are many examples where science is under attack today, in contrast to kind of previous generations that kind of embraced technology and saw it as a way out of humanity's problems.
So for the last several minutes as you've been speaking, I've been looking over at my co-pilot, and he's been nodding pretty regularly. So, Silas, do you have anything to add, or do you want to ask a question to direct the conversation?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the statements in the science, especially in GMOs as well. I approve of that. You can obviously do it wrong, but if you do it correctly, it's just a good thing overall. Also, thinking about the cultural appropriation, if it's okay to take it back to that, I was actually just talking about that with some of my friends a few days ago because the World Series of baseball just happened here. I don't know if you watched it, but the two teams in it were the Cubs and the Indians, the Cleveland Indians. And the Cleveland Indians, we were talking about the logo, which is a caricature of an Indian. And I was just thinking to myself, if that was the same logo in the same art style, but it was a caricature of an African man, it would be almost immediately taken down. Like, in my opinion, it would be immediately taken away. The whole team would rebrand. There'd be a big publicity thing about it, but it's not. And I just thought that was interesting. It's also interesting that the football team for Cleveland, the Cleveland Redskins, the Washington Redskins, excuse me, they have also a caricature of an Indian as their logo, but it is much more stately. It's a profile. It's not much of a cartoon, but people have their problem with their name of the Cleveland Redskins much more than they have a problem with the logo. And I just thought it was kind of interesting to compare it since it may be that the indigenous people are not as big of a percentage of the population that we don't care as much about that. But I just if it was a caricature of an African man, it would be immediately complete rebrand, big publicity, disaster.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very fascinated with black politics, and we have a very black people in the UK have a very different history and a very different story to black people in America who have suffered greatly over the centuries. But what's interesting is that the black American story is increasingly becoming the global black story, which is a very inaccurate view of history, and a lot of these attitudes, and so we're getting a kind of increasing intolerance. But cultural appropriation fascinates me because fundamentally it's an attack on cultural and racial mixing. That's what it's about. It's about stopping people mixing together, and to me, mixing is the best thing that should happen. As a liberal, there's nothing better you can do than mix cultures together. And I've traveled to Africa. My partner is Nigerian in origin. I've traveled to various parts of West Africa, and I have clothes from Ghana, from Senegal, from Nigeria, and so on. And I know that the people who sold these things to me, or friends from West Africa who have given these things to me as gifts, are delighted to see their culture being spread and being adopted by people from outside their area. It's if a Senegalese person sees me wearing a Senegalese shirt, they're delighted that someone outside Senegal is adopting Senegalese culture, and yet, a black Westerner will see me in the same shirt and attack and possibly attack me for for cultural appropriation. And it's a very racist and very bullying mentality, because they have no idea where the shirt comes from. They couldn't find Senegal on the map many times. And yet, so there's an attack on cultural mixing, which is a very conservative thing. And there are so many stories that come up under cultural appropriation now that are very worrying. There was one from California recently where a reggae festival was cancelled because most of the participants were white and the budget was pulled. And I've been involved in the reggae scene because I grew up with a lot of people of Jamaican origin, and, reggae was part of my upbringing. And I know that today the reggae scene is primarily white, because it's been adopted widely across the United States and Europe. And yet we're now being told that reggae shouldn't be a white thing. And yet, many artists from Jamaica make their living from playing to white audiences in Britain, in Germany, in the United States. And now we have black Americans basically attacking the living of Jamaican artists because they don't think white people should be dancing to Jamaican music. It doesn't make any sense at any level, but it's very racist and it's very backward. And yet this has kind of become the liberal zeitgeist.
It's interesting. The people that I think of as, I try not to use the term in conversation, but I still use it in my head, the social justice warriors on the extreme new left, they have nothing but hatred and contempt for the people that they would describe as being alt-right, which is the sort of new, younger, non-traditional right-wing school that is developing here in the United States. And yet they are both against race mixing. It's just that only the alt-rights will say race mixing. The exact same process on the left is described as cultural appropriation. Yeah,
totally. And I think the main difference between the alt-right and the social justice kind of left is that the social justice left is kind of more middle class and white, and the alt-right is more working class and white. So actually there's a class divide rather than any kind of political difference between them.
We're a classless society here in the United States, so that doesn't apply to us at all.
Of course, yeah. But the same applies over here. The far right, the fascist right, is primarily white and working class. The kind of social justice left is very left and middle class, and yet both have kind of decided that cultural and racial mixing are kind of bad things, and have decided to attack them. And both sides are wrong and both sides are dangerous, but actually it's the left that's far more influential, because it's the left that has the journalists and the politicians and the people in positions of power. The white working class here and in the United States are a fairly powerless and fairly derided bunch of people.
Are you familiar with the term cuckservative?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, that might be an American thing, but people in the alt-right decry the traditional conservatives as cuckservatives because they have been cuckolded. They have given away too much to the liberals, so that now, for all intents and purposes, the mainstream Republicans are identical to mainstream Democrats. And I think that criticism resonates on the left as well, that a lot of people are very critical of Hillary Clinton because she is essentially a neoconservative. She's very strong on defense, she's very strong on corporate power, and she makes noises about support for working people, but her policies certainly don't reflect that position. So people on the alt-right would criticize somebody like, say, George W. Bush as being a cuckservative for totally giving up on all of the conservative issues on which conservatives or all the cultural issues on which conservatives used to take a stand, in which they have now sort of tucked their tail between their legs and come into submission, particularly on racial issues.
Yeah, I think, and we have the same thing happening here. I think because, what's really happened is that there's a polarization of politics. And so we have people, the center is kind of being squeezed, being shrunk as people head either to the left or right. And it's about ideological purity. The people on the left see everyone to the right of them as right wing, and the people on the right see everyone to the left of them as left wing. So yeah, I guess the conservative thing, we have a similar thing now on the left, where anyone who's even centre left is called a Tory, which is a member of the Conservative Party over here. But yeah, the ideological purity thing is kind of worrying and dangerous, and it mirrors, I think, what happened in the 1930s in Europe, which isn't a time we really want to replicate.
So, Jerry, you said this was your first book. Let me just remind people who might be coming in late that this is C-Realm Radio, and that we're talking with Jerry Barnett, the author of Porn Panic, Sex and Censorship in the UK. Jerry, you say this is your first book. It's very well written. What brought you to the point of writing a book?
Thanks. I mean, to an extent, I've always been a frustrated author, like many people. I've been a blogger for many years. I've run a blog called moreonwatch.net for many years, which is kind of just a place I can rant, and until recently, anonymously. And I also run sexandcensorship.org. So I have a lot of writing experience, and I've kind of felt a book coming for a long time. But this was the book I had to write, probably because I was because I was involved in the porn industry, and I'm a technologist. I think I saw things. I thought I saw problems coming a long time before other people did, and my kind of awakening to the fact that the left had got very conservative began about 4 or 5 years ago, and I've been documenting it, blogging about it for 4 or 5 years, and eventually I felt I had to write this book, and I have a 3.5-year-old son, so while my partner was pregnant, I took the chance to take 2 weeks away and begin writing the book, because otherwise I'd have never begun it. And actually, I basically wrote 2 books. Zero Books looked at it, and they liked it, but they said it was too long. So the first book is Porn Panic, and that's really about the cultural and social changes and the rise of fascism. And the second book is going to focus more strongly on British state censorship, and how the censorship state has been slowly marshalling its forces to attack the internet. And this is the other thing which has really worried me, is that I've been fairly close up to what the British state is doing, and to seeing how the British state's response to the internet has been building, and how they're looking to censor it. And we're very close now to a law which will probably come in next spring, which is going to introduce for the first time in censorship of the internet on an official level. And almost nobody has seen it coming, because they've used porn as the testing ground for censorship. So I guess I was privileged in that I was very early in seeing what they were doing, almost 10 years ago, and now it's going to hit us. And I've been trying to wake up journalists to this for a long time, because when something is presented as protecting children from pornography, it's fairly hard to kind of create a movement against this. You don't want to be the guy who's campaigning against protecting children from pornography, and yet what they're doing isn't about protecting children from pornography at all. It's about creating a censorship regime which can be rolled out, and this is really, it's worrying. It should be worrying globally, because Britain is pioneering democratic censorship of the internet. We will be the first democratic country which has an official internet censor, and the United States may be protected by the First Amendment, but Canada and Australia and various other countries around the European Union and so on aren't. And the United Kingdom is trying to create a model for internet censorship which can be acceptable within democratic countries.
Well, the question of internet censorship is on a whole other hour's conversation, I think. But just to dip into it very quickly, it seems to me that there's such a huge volume of internet content that to censor it effectively with human beings, you would have to marshal a huge portion of your population to all act as censors, or you have to do it algorithmically.
Yeah. The Chinese have tried the former approach, and actually it's fairly effective. The Chinese has a massive censorship bureaucracy. I don't think the UK would go that way, but the way censorship is actually fairly easy to apply. So you once you find one person, $100,000 for breaching a law, then everyone else who is in that kind of space is quickly going to close their websites down. It's a kind of a less severe version of what happens, say, in Bangladesh, where atheist bloggers tend to get hacked to death at regular intervals. But so you can punish people by example, and once one person has been fined a huge amount of money for breaking a particular censorship law, most people aren't going to be brave enough to keep breaking that law. And to an extent, Britain has this kind of nice history of nice paternalistic control, which is specific to our culture, and George Orwell kind of pinpoints it in 1984, where most people, where you have a kind of a nice regime of totalitarianism in 1984, and Orwell was writing about British culture. We have a load of crazy laws which most people over here are completely unaware of, but there's a whole range of pornography now, which is illegal to possess, and most people aren't aware of this. That people are going to prison for they may be arrested for a completely unrelated reason. They have their smartphone seized, and they'll have a video clip on their smartphone which breaches a particular possession law, and they end up with a fine or a prison sentence and being put on the sex offenders register. And a lot of the content that's covered by these laws features acts which are completely legal to do behind closed doors. We're not talking about child abuse or rape or anything like this. We're talking about BDSM material and things like this. So we have a creeping regime of censorship here. But the law which is coming in next spring, which is going to be called the Digital Economy Act, will create for the first time an official internet censor. It draws very tight lines about what kind of sexual acts are allowed and not allowed, and it will pretty much stamp out a lot of publishers who are in the UK, but it also gives the censor the power to act against overseas companies who are breaking British law, and ultimately that's going to lead to blocking of sites. It may not stop British people being able to see porn from overseas, but it's going to it creates a precedent where the government is now allowed to start attacking overseas content which breaches British standards and which may be completely legal in the rest of Europe or in the United States.
Hey, Jerry, we've come to the end of the first hour of C-Realm Radio. I know that Silas has a follow-on question for you. Can we keep you on the line for another 10 minutes?
Sure.
So we are at the top of the hour. Let me tell you that you are listening to 91.5 FM, WOOL, Black Sheep Radio, Bellows Falls, Vermont, Walpole, New Hampshire. We're talking with Jerry Barnett, the author of Porn Panic. So, Silas.
Hey, I was just, as an American teenager, I have not heard of these censorship laws that are going to be in place in the UK soon, and you just explained a good amount of them to the audience. I just wanted to go a little more in depth. So currently, it is just censoring certain types of pornography, but do you think it's going to go on? Is there going to be like bad words or censored? I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but like, you think it's going to keep snowballing? Yeah, and it has been snowballing for a long time. So yeah, we have a bunch of anti-porn laws which most people are completely unaware of. But yeah, as I mentioned previously, people kind of accidentally, they may get arrested and find themselves on the sex offenders register, literally for having a clip that someone might have sent them on WhatsApp or something, So that's one example of the kinds of laws that we already have. But yeah, we do have censorship of words already, and again, in a way that wouldn't be possible in the United States, at least without the ACLU or somebody challenging them. So we have the concept of, I think it's called malicious communication, and we've had people arrested on Twitter
and now we're running at the rate of about 2,000 arrests a year for sending malicious communications on the internet, and this kind of partly covers hate speech and this kind of thing. But the idea of hate speech has been broadened immeasurably, so that being offensive or being unpleasant to people online can result in police arrest. And I give some examples in the book. There was an early example on Twitter where someone sent a tweet saying, so he was due to go on vacation, and there was snow, and his local airport was closed, and he tweeted something like, I see Robin Hood Airport is closed, it better open by next week or I'm going to blow the whole place sky high. It's the kind of thing people tweet all the time. And he was arrested. Not only arrested, he faced trial. He was found guilty. He was found guilty on appeal, and only on another appeal he was found not guilty, and that was done with the help of a lot of funding, given by the public. And that's the kind of thing that people can be arrested for. But there are people that are now going to prison for tweeting offensive things to other people. And again, I give some examples in the book. So yeah, we have a whole range of laws, including malicious communications, including hate speech, including and especially related to sexual imagery and so on, for which people can be arrested and put on trial. And I think the sexual imagery stuff is often particularly worrying because you can be put on the sex offenders register for possessing the wrong kind of image, and people associate the sex offenders register with child abuse, and so there's this massive social stigma. This can destroy a person's life when often they've received. And there was one guy who received a computer-generated clip of a woman having sex with a tiger. It was quite clear. It was kind of a joke clip, and it was quite clearly an animated clip. And yet he was arrested and faced trial and so on, and eventually cleared. But he lost his job. He lost access to his children. He was assaulted and put in and hospitalized because, once you're known as a sex offender in your town, so these are very powerful kind of means of population control. As these cases get popularized, people think more and more carefully about whether they're going to look at pornography, whether they're going to share pornography, because nobody knows what the rules are. I'm probably one of a few hundred people in the whole country that can tell you exactly what's classed as extreme pornography, and yet millions of people in this country are breaking the law and without realizing it, and risk prison and risk being put on the sex offenders register. But yeah, we have a kind of very in Britain, like almost nowhere else in the West, we have a huge trust of the state because we have a state we have centuries of democracy, and we have a state which is pretty well behaved. Our police don't go around shooting people on a regular basis and this kind of thing. So we are the most trusting population when it comes to the state. And if the state says it's doing something for our own good, we normally accept it far more readily than almost anyone else does. And, and that's dangerous. We're going to wake up in the next year or two to a real heavy regime of censorship that kind of nobody noticed.
Very different from the United States, where we have conspiracy programs that say, that the government is engaged in eugenics, and they are possibly allied with extra-dimensional beings who are here for nefarious purposes.
Witchcraft.
Yeah, and this is all very mainstream. This is not a fringe in the U.S.
We do have the anti-establishment kind of backlash is happening everywhere, including here. But, relatively, we are far more trusting of our state. And I've been to the US many times. I go to Spain fairly regularly. And Spain had a dictatorship, a horrible dictatorship until the 1970s.
A fascist dictatorship.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Spanish will come out onto the streets at the slightest hint of police misbehavior, and the Spanish will face off against riot police. I've seen it myself. They're incredibly brave. They'll stand face to face with riot police, and because they're not prepared to let that come back. But the British people, we simply haven't experienced this in at any point really in our recent history, and so we go along with stuff. And on a separate issue, we're about to have a law which is going to invade our privacy. It's nicknamed the Snoopers Charter. This is going to be introduced fairly soon, which is going to massively invade our privacy. It gives the state the right to record every URL we access, every text message, every email message, and so on that we send. And in the interest of keeping us safe from terrorism or whatever their latest excuse is. But again, we're kind of leading the world into state invasion of privacy. And again, you go back to 1984, where Orwell envisioned that every home would have a vid screen on the wall, which was a two-way communication device, and it would be illegal to switch it off. And kind of that's kind of where we're at with our smartphones.
Yeah, except it's not illegal to switch them off. We just don't dare.
No,
we'll be out of step for half a second.
No, I mean, I think the one thing Orwell maybe didn't envisage is to what extent we will voluntarily surrender our privacy. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm personally more worried about censorship. And I think, but yeah, invasions of privacy are massive, and we're moving to a kind of data mining approach to crime fighting, where the state is going to be able to identify the most likely 0.1% of the population to be involved in crime and to target them based on probability, based on their online access and so on. And that's the reality. We have that coming. But yeah, the British state. The British state is now challenging. So things like we have iMessage from Apple, we have WhatsApp, we have which are encrypted end to end, and which the British state has no means of accessing. So we have ways to message each other, which the British state can't intercept. And the British state is now heading for a clash with the likes of WhatsApp and and Apple and other companies, where there have already been informal threats to block WhatsApp from operating in the UK unless they give access to the intelligence services to our messages. To an extent, that's why companies like WhatsApp have introduced end-to-end encryption, so that actually WhatsApp don't have the physical means to get they're physically incapable of giving up messages. But yeah, it's the British state is kind of pioneering state attacks on these communication mechanisms. When I say they're pioneering, I mean it's already happened in places like Ethiopia and so on, where these apps have been banned. But it's the British are kind of trying to pioneer a democratic totalitarianism, if you like.
Well, Jerry, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Again, I've been talking with Jerry Barnett. Is it Barnett or Barnett?
I say Barnett, but Americans say Barnett.
Okay. He's the author of Porn Panic, Sex and Censorship in the UK. Jerry, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I enjoyed your book. I recommend everybody go and read it.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.